Thank y'all for being here. It's my first time doing something like this. The story I'm going to read is called The End. It's loosely based on the death of my father. It's a quiet room, 200-3 CICU. Take the elevator to the second floor, left turn, go to the end of the long hall, another left turn, then past the chapel and into the stuffy little waiting room with the antiseptic smell in the air that sits adjacent to the cardiac intensive care unit. His room is just inside the large double swinging doors with a sign with large black block letters banning entry when the doors are closed. Cheap but sturdy office quality chairs line the walls of the waiting room, occupied by huddled groups of family members waiting on the 30-minute visitation every 3 hours. Nobody really speaks up, just muffled voices kept low, private, discussing painful details with Fox News droning on in the background about this life-shattering event or another, from a conservative point of view, of course. Outside, it's a gorgeous day, mid-70s, but with a little fall nip occasionally when the wind kicks up. The bright October sunshine lights up the oranges and reds in the turning trees, vibrant and colorful, and such a contrast to the drab pale yellow and moss green painting the scene inside those hospital walls just steps away. I walk away from the main entrance of the building with my hands in my pockets, just wandering, no destination, nowhere particular to go, just searching for a breath of fresh air. Horns go by attached to unseen cars on the highway. I don't even glance their way, immune to the noise, listening only to the thoughts in my head. Trying to wrap my mind around sickness and death is a hard thing to do for the inexperienced like me, especially hitting so close to home. Dad. He always seemed so invincible, so tough, almost intimidating at times when I was young. Not so much anymore, but still seemingly immune to pain, if not totally bulletproof. Timex man, they call him, takes a licking and keeps on ticking. He always bounces back, but maybe not this time. He looks tired and old and yes, frail. In my mind, I'm standing there next to his bed and he looks at me to help him, but my hands are empty and I'm no help. It makes me sad. I understand an 85-year-old heart, the number of beats, the highs and lows of 85 years of life, from looking up at your mother's face at birth to the fascination of being 13, then 18, then 21, adulthood, women, mom, marriage, children, jobs, retirement, grandchildren, highs and lows, goods and bads along the road to life. We aren't meant to be here forever, but it sure is hard to leave. Next thing I know, I'm in my car and I'm driving, going through familiar motions, stopping at the red lights like I'm trained to do. I think about him teaching me to drive. The family car was a Ford Galaxie 500 with a straight shift on the column. The way he taught me to use the clutch was to make me drive up a small hill near our house on Avenue T and stop at the stop sign at the top. When a car pulled up behind us, he got out of the passenger seat and walked home. I was scared and mad and frustrated and came close to rolling back into the car behind me, but I didn't. And I never had a problem with the clutch again. Driving could never get any worse than it was for me right then, but I made it. He made me make it. We had some tough times then, he and I, turbulent times during the late 60s and early 70s. I had a serious disrespect for authority, and we clashed frequently. It was one of those he liked country, I like rock and roll kind of relationships. But we got through it. He didn't give up on me like he probably should have, probably could have, but he didn't. I'm sure that was a hard thing for him to do, love me when I was so hard to love. Now here we are 40 years later, so much history between us. He's helped make me who I am. He's part of my identity. And I filter everything through what he's taught me. Because of him, I understand better how to deal with sickness and pain, and now death. It's a process and one more step on the journey. I lose track of time, and I notice from the clock on the dash of the car, that I've been gone almost an hour and I'm about to miss visitation. I head back and search the crowded parking lot for a spot, which I guess is a sign the hospital business is good. I find one at the end of the lot and hike back. I enter the front door to the hospital and nod to the familiar security guard at the desk as I walk by. It's become a routine. I'm like a fixture, part of the place. I follow my trail back to CICU and arrive just after the doors have opened for visitation. Mom's already there along with the rest of the family. I'm the last to arrive. A lady I don't recognize sits in the corner, trying not to intrude, but obviously with a job to do. She clears her throat and I look at her. She's very thin with a nervous face and pale skin. She looks like the nervous type, but she doesn't appear nervous, at least not now. I'm Jennifer with hospice, and I've been assigned your husband's case, she says to a grieving wife like my mother, by rote for probably the millionth time. We have some decisions to make, and if everyone's here, we'll get started, she stated, very businesslike. She pulled her chair forward in front of my mom and jumped right in. Does he have a medical directive or a living will? I don't see one in his file. Has he executed a non-resuscitate form? We really need to get all of this paperwork together and in the file. She stopped her inquiry and looked at us to gauge our comprehension. I could feel my face begin to flush as my blood pressure began to rise. All of my anger at this situation, not just her, but the entire ordeal, was about to surface, directed at this callous woman who lacked the tact of a drunken sailor. I think this can wait until another time, I said, barely controlling my anger. This is a little sudden, and we need time to talk with Dad and among ourselves. Thank you for understanding, I continued as I rose, indicating the meeting was over for now. But she wasn't ready to leave that soon. It's time for your husband to go home, she stated again, directed to my mother, ignoring me. We can't offer him anything further here he couldn't get there, and he'd be more comfortable there. Is that agreeable to the family? Jennifer asked us again, directed at Mom. Mom looked around at the three of us siblings, clearly at a loss. Dad was resting with his eyes closed, but he was listening, an interested bystander, not consulted for his opinion. I could tell by his breathing that he was taking it all in. He opened his eyes and looked directly at me and said, "What do you think I should do? Non-resuscitate, go home, give up? Tell me what you do." I blinked hard, tears welling in my eyes, and I heard the words I was saying. You don't want to live like this, hooked up to a machine breathing for you. You fought hard. Go home and be comfortable with your old cat. Ringo misses you. And I began to cry. He sighed and closed his eyes again and nodded, and it was done. Jennifer rose and said she'd make the arrangements for his transfer home by ambulance, and then she left. It was quiet. No one spoke. When visitation was over, we left and went home to move furniture to make room for his hospital bed in the den with a big screen TV. When he got home about 2 hours later, everything was ready for him, and he seemed in good spirits and genuinely glad to be home. His old cat Ringo climbed up on his bed and made himself comfortable like everything was the same as always. But it wasn't, and we knew it. We all gathered around the bed talking in low voices, and he closed his eyes and appeared to drift asleep. He had a smile on his face and he seemed at ease. About an hour later, he exhaled hard and stiffened and then relaxed. He was at peace. He had left us, and this was the end of his story, the end of his first-person account. Thank you.
Up next is Randy Moon. Randy is a masterful storyteller whose gritty crime fiction novels captivate readers. Originally writing under the pen name Skylar Randall, his novels Jacqueline Willoughby, Raina, and the award-winning Francis Laurent earned acclaim, with Francis Laurent winning the Audiobook Reviewer's Best Thriller in Crime Award in 2021. Now writing as Randy Moon, his latest book, Questionable Practice, promises shocking twists exploring the darkest corners of human nature. When not writing, he resides in McCalla, Alabama with his wife Yvette and their West Highland carrier, Q. It is my pleasure to present to you Randy Moon with a selection from Questionable Practice.
This excerpt comes from my latest crime fiction novel, Questionable Practice. In it, we follow Dr. Robert Madigan, a medical student drawn into the dark underworld as a hired killer, as he prepares to carry out a brutal assignment. The afternoon sun glimmered along the outside of the residential Parthenon. Its gaudy design spoke to the ego of its owner, amidst the other modest family homes on the block. Robert began his cautious ascent up the marble stairs. His information assured him the door would be open. The hinges on the ornate wooden door screeched as Robert settled inside. Somehow, the house looked larger on the inside, its exterior paling against the priceless antiques, vases, and sculptures lining the lavish halls. If he didn't know any better, Robert would have mistaken the place for a museum rather than a man's home. He slid his black leather medical bag onto a nearby table, placing his hat squarely next to it. With casual familiarity, he shuffled out of his gray suit jacket and hung it on the nearby coat rack. Retrieving his bag again, he made his way across the dark oaken floor, the echoes of his footsteps filling the space. He didn't need to be concerned about alerting Crowell. He had already been secured. A large painting of Crowell stared over a grand piano in the living room. His expression was pure satisfaction, his posture almost regal as he sat against a grand chair fit for a king. Robert scowled at the painting. Maybe he didn't need to read the letter, he thought. Crowell looked to be exactly the type of man deserving of this treatment. The taller they are, the harder they fall. Robert climbed the grand staircase towards the second floor. His feet slowed halfway as apprehension took him. Taking a deep breath, he looked at the large ornate chandelier that centered the circling staircase, its crystals illuminated by the light spilling in through the open window. It threw rays of rainbow light across the front foyer, casting a fantastical glow. The sight chased away the last remnants of Robert's anxiety, leaving only peace in its wake. He continued forward. At the top, Robert stepped through an open door and into a large office. He spared a momentary glance at the finely crafted bookcases before turning to the oaken desk at the center of the room. Two wingback chairs faced it, with a third at its head. A large golden-haired man sat on this third chair, tied by his arms, legs, and chest. He threw his mask against his restraints and mumbled through a linen cloth that was stuffed in his mouth. Crowell's eyes widened in desperation at the sight of Robert. Robert only nodded politely and set his bag on the desk in front of Crowell. He rolled his shirt sleeves up to his elbows, released the latch on his bag, and opened it wide. With steady hands, Robert pulled out 2 leather gloves and slid his fingers gracefully through. He unwrapped the syringe and placed it on the desk. The entire time, Robert didn't say a word. Crowell's brow tightened in confusion. As if in answer, Robert reached in again and pulled out a Colt pistol. Crowell's eyes lit up in horror. He threw every ounce of his strength against his binds, his violent thrashing eventually bringing the chair to a topple. He crashed to the floor. The binds were no looser than they had been. Robert didn't miss a beat. With his tools neatly prepared, he retrieved a thick envelope and placed it on the desk. As Clark had suggested, Robert also brought a little something to take the edge off. He slipped a small glass from the bag, accompanied by a pint of Clark's top shelf whiskey. The lid came loose with a flick of the wrist, and Robert poured himself a portion of the rich liquid. Involuntarily, his hand flinched, and a few drops of whiskey dropped onto the desk. Robert whipped out a towel and dabbed it away before resealing the bottle and returning it to the bag. All the while, Crowell had been on the floor. His limbs remained strapped to the chair, unmoving as he grumbled nonsense through his gag. Robert swished the whiskey around in his glass before taking a small sniff. A sharp tip of his glass brought the whiskey to his lips, and the liquid ran down his throat in a river of smooth warmth. With growing ease, Robert strolled around the office, admiring the Roman artworks that adorned the walls. He wore the persona of the good doctor now, a stranger to Robert's own self. Having made his rounds, Robert scraped a wingback chair across the floor towards where Crowell groveled on the ground. He lowered himself in the chair with a benevolent smile, as if he were an honored guest. "You have such a lovely home," he sipped again from his glass. "This is the best whiskey I've ever had." He beheld the glass and studied the honey golden liquid glinting through the patterned glass. Robert crossed his legs, balancing the whiskey atop his knee, and folding his hands in his lap. "Mr. Crowell, let me introduce myself. My name is Dr. Robert Madigan. I was sent here by Nanny Esposito, Angelo Bianchi, and Carlo Moretti. They arranged for my visit." Crowell's eyes bulged in recognition. The name seemed to induce a sort of animalistic fit within the man. He thrashed at his restraints with renewed desperation, wiggling on the floor like some earthworm. It was a pathetic sight. Robert found there was no pleasure in watching him in such a state. Mercifully, he lifted the chair and righted Crowell. "I know, I would feel the same way if I were in your shoes," Robert assured him. "A stranger, a doctor no less, comes into your beautiful home and tells you you're about to meet your maker. You should be upset." Robert allowed himself another slow sip of whiskey, then clinked his glass back onto the desk. He then unfolded the letter bearing Mr. Crowell's name. "I have a message here that I've been instructed to read to you." A cry of deep despair tore from Mr. Crowell, despite the muffled gag. Robert could sense his pitiful desperation. He fixed his eyes on Crowell for a moment before drawing his attention to the letter. Curiosity burnt a hole in him as he read aloud. "William, you worthless, impecunious deadbeat. You thought you could pull the wool right over our eyes and steal the rights to our property down south? You stole our money that we entrusted you to invest in the Alabama coal industry. You tussled with the wrong family. Consider this your penance. We're sending you to hell. Enjoy the last minutes of your life, and I hope that your last words carry only remorse and regret." Robert folded the letter and placed it beside his bag, unable to resist giving it a gentle pat. "Mr. Crowell, I am giving you a choice. Both, I assure you, will be painless. The pistol, of course, will complete the execution instantaneously. The syringe will simply send you quickly into a permanent sleep. The choice is yours. Thank you."
A Tuscaloosa native and graduate of Harvard Law School, Jack Sharman is a white-collar criminal defense lawyer. He holds an MFA in fiction from Washington University in St. Louis. His short stories have been published in the Southern Review and elsewhere. Jack's comments on white-collar trials and government investigations have appeared in the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, the New York Post, and other national outlets. He blogs about white-collar crime and cocktails at whitecollarwire@jacksharman.com, and they're quite entertaining. Today, Jack is reading from The Whisper Book, a political thriller in progress.
This scene is from the draft of a political thriller, the working title of which is The Whisper Book. The title refers to a book that is a sort of Bible or ledger of misdeeds maintained by a college secret society whose alumni are embedded in Wall Street and in Washington. The current president of the United States is such an alumnus. Everybody in the story is chasing the Whisper Book. This scene is from the point of view of the antagonist, whose name is Dylan. After a disastrous series of events, he is summoned to a meeting at the Stephen Decatur House off Lafayette Square in Washington. He is meeting with three others, a senator from Alabama, a Maryland lawyer, and the White House cabinet secretary. The three others are attempting to find and use the Whisper Book to unseat the sitting president by impeachment if possible, but by coup if necessary. Stella had taken a turn for the worse. Dylan could hardly hear what Lehman was saying. The blood rushed in his ears. Beneath it all was the sound of what Dylan imagined cystic fibrosis looked like in his daughter's lungs. Pale green waving rushes in water, rising higher and higher. We hired a professional, not a cowboy. There's a trail of blood up and down the East Coast. What were you thinking? When Stella's cystic fibrosis was first diagnosed, it was like the doctor was speaking to someone else. Everything else had been overcome, everything. This could be overcome as well, or so he thought. Dylan was back in front of the fireplace at the Stephen Decatur house, the 4 chairs in their customary places. Outside, Washington had turned bitterly cold. The steward had brought him a Gibson and lay untouched on the side table. This has gotten out of control, and that drug-addled Virginia State trooper won't go away. Lehman was goading Dylan into an outburst. He's not a trooper. What? The senator from Alabama stirred his drink. Always liked state troopers. He's a special agent, a detective. They call him special agent. I don't give a rat's ass what they call him. Lehman slammed his glass on the table. The senator recoiled as though the glass had shattered. The cabinet secretary leaned forward in disapproval. Lehman, well, what would you expect me to do? The cabinet secretary, Shirley Grant, seemed the only one in the room unruffled by events. She turned to Dylan grandly as though introducing him at an awards dinner. I expect our friend to fix things for us. As soon as we tell him what we know, he will fix things for us. On the private plane back from Charleston, Dylan had provided Lehman a report over the encrypted phone. Caroline Eden's friend was roughed up, and Caroline Eden was somewhere in the wind. Even with the encryption, Dylan had been vague. The old Maryland lawyer had set up a meeting for the following evening, a command performance. Dylan knew it would not be good. Before he left the house, he kissed his sleeping daughter carefully on the forehead. The skin across her forehead was as pale as the rushes Dylan imagined her disease to be. He had slipped his .38 into a kidney holster and adjusted his jacket, although if things were bad enough he had to shoot someone in the sitting room of the Stephen Decatur house, he may as well put a bullet through his own brain. Senator Preston addressed the cabinet secretary as though Dylan were not in the room. You're really going to tell him? The senator looked to Lehman for guidance, but Lehman just shrugged. In for a penny, in for a pound. Grant touched her finger to the simple strand of pearls around her neck, although as far as Dylan could see, the pearls were in perfect alignment. I don't think we have a meaningful choice. Another touch on another pearl, then a pointed stare at Dylan. This contractor you use, the one with the name, what is it, Latin? Dylan had feared this moment would come, nothing to do but barrel through. Quo vadis? Senator Preston burped. Wasn't that a movie? Let's not worry about movies right now. Shirley Grant did not look at the senator when she spoke and remained fixed on Dylan. We have a problem, something that wasn't in the script. Lehman drew himself up as though he were giving a report in school. The Russians, your contractors mixed up with the Russians. Something shifted within Dylan, something fearsome and hard, like he had lost Stella already to those pale, wavy reeds. What do you mean, the Russians? Though his mind raced with some good guesses. Lehman knew the situation with certain Polish investors in Dylan's firm. Had Lehman told the other two? QV is not that stupid. Or that smart, apparently. The cabinet secretary leaned back in her chair, seemingly exhausted. Signals intelligence is useful domestically as well as abroad. A quick glance to Senator Preston, with appropriate congressional oversight, of course. She turned back to Dylan. The signals collection program wasn't monitoring your contractor. It was for the Russians or for people Russian adjacent. Your man got picked up. What do you mean picked up? Dylan was considering taking a big slug of the Gibson, but thought better of it. Grant was committing a federal crime, revealing to him the existence and contents of an intelligence program involving the Russians that Dylan was not read into and for which he had zero clearance. Conversations with people he really should not have been talking to. Apparently, after you asked him for help finding this book, he figured out its value. QV figured out it was something to do with President Grimes. Dylan shook his head. I don't believe it. Well, son, you better start believing it. Lehman stepped to the fireplace, picked up a poker, and stabbed the logs with fury. I wonder how he was able to get with the Russians. Oh, well, Dylan knew Lehman knew exactly how QV could have such a contact. Anyway, looks like he's been working with them the whole time, or pretty much the whole time. The GRU. Shirley Grant arched an eyebrow. You do know what the GRU is. Dylan do. The GRU was the main directorate of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation, the Russian Foreign Military Intelligence Agency, the sister organization and fierce competitor to the former KGB. The GRU had interfered in American elections, attempted a coup in Montenegro, cyber-attacked the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, attempted to assassinate Russian defectors, and offered bounties to the Taliban to attack U.S. personnel in Afghanistan. It operated Russia's Spetsnaz, the military special forces. If there really was something sufficient in the book to bring down President Grimes, and if that son of a bitch QV had figured it out and offered to sell the book to the GRU, everybody in the Stephen Decatur house that evening was walking on the knife edge of treason. Billin changed his mind and took a hefty swig of the Gibson. What now? Although he knew. What now? Shirley Grant leaned forward. Her dark skin was smooth and blemish-free, hard across her face. What now is, you shut down your boy right now. It's one thing to get rid of a sitting president. It's a whole nother problem to be doing step and fetch it for Russian military intelligence. Later, the only thing Dylan remembered from the end of the meeting was one of her pearls. For the first time, one of the pearls was out of line with the others, as though it were trying to run away. Thank you.
Donna Gossam Thomas is an author, instructor, and editor. She earned a master's in creative writing from the University of Alabama at Birmingham. Her short stories have been published in PMS Magazine and the Birmingham News. In addition to writing short stories, Donna is completing her first novel, which tells the story of her great-grandfather's journey from slavery to landowner to legacy. Although she loves writing, her true passion is her 4 grandchildren, Jordan, Caden, Cruz, and Callie. Today, Donna will be reading Neighbors.
Thank you. Neighbors. I grew up in an all-Negro neighborhood located near Birmingham, Alabama's airport. The airplanes flew so low, if you got a running start, you could leap high enough to land on the wing and fly away to Never Never Land. At least that's what I told myself. We lived in a small yellow and white 3-bedroom, 1-bath home. It was the first home my mom and dad had purchased. We were all proud. There was a bedroom for me and my sister, a bedroom for mom and dad, and my brother got a bedroom all to himself. This was the typical home for most of the other Negro families living in the neighborhood called Roseville Park. Directly across the street facing our home were the Johnsons, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, along with their children, Jannie Mae, Carrie, and Junior. Jannie Mae was in college. Carrie and Junior were in high school. They would take turns babysitting us when mom and dad needed a night out. My mom and Mrs. Johnson would become very close over the years, never relinquishing their friendship, even when my uncle took Jannie Mae out on a date and stayed all night. My parents called Mr. Johnson the ultimate porch sitter. When he wasn't working, Mr. Johnson would sit on the front porch and watch everything going on in the neighborhood. He was the 60s version of Neighborhood Watch. My mom would often say, he sits on that porch and watches everything we do. I can't go out this house without him looking in my face. Well, actually, she said, he sits on that damn porch and watches everything we do. I can't shit without him looking in my face. But we are Catholics, so I shouldn't have said that. When Junior had to go to fight for his country in Vietnam, we all became porch sitters, waiting for the mailman to bring any news of Junior's life outside the simple, safe community we shared in Roseville Park. When Junior came back home all perfect and sane, the whole neighborhood was there to rejoice in his return. Next door to the right of us were the Fords. They were the young couple of the neighborhood. They were newlyweds and were trying to have a baby. I knew because sometime Mrs. Ford would come over to talk to my mom. She would cry because she couldn't get pregnant. Eventually, she found out she couldn't have children. They adopted, and I became the official babysitter for their son, Carlton. That is, until Mrs. Ford quit her job as a nurse because her boss wanted her to train a white lady to be her supervisor. I heard her telling my mom, "Why should I train her to do the job I'm already doing? They are going to pay her more money and make her my supervisor." I told them I would quit before I did that. She quit. Eventually, the Fords moved away. Mr. Ford had an affair and conceived a daughter from that union. Mrs. Ford forgave him, accepted the child. Now they have the family they always wanted. The neighbors to the left of us were the Freemans. There was Mr. and Mrs. Freeman and their 4 children, baby boys Cindy, Lawrence, and Mitchell. Mrs. Freeman's didn't work. She was a stay-at-home mom like mine. My mom and Mrs. Freeman got along very well, but my sister and I wished that Mom or Mrs. Freeman had jobs because Mom was always agreeing to let her do things. Mrs. Freeman's daughter had very short hair. I mean, really short. No longer than an Indian nickel, my daddy would say. So Mom agreed to let Mrs. Freeman comb our hair since it hung below our shoulders. My sister and I would inch next door like little brown centipedes with comb, brush, hair grease, and barrettes in our hands, only to return an hour later with 4 corn-rolled braids stretching from front to back, each with a different colored barrette dangling at the end. Little did we know that in a few years this hairstyle would become a symbol of African American pride. Eventually, Mrs. Freeman lost her grip on sanity when she started praising the Lord a little too much. She died when her children were in middle school. Baby boy took it the hardest. He was her favorite. At 18, he announced he was gay. At 21, he shot himself because he couldn't handle the alienation. He didn't die, but he lay paralyzed from the neck down. My mom kept in touch with him. She would visit him every Christmas. He died 10 years ago. The Harris house was diagonal to ours and next door to the Johnsons. There was Mrs. Harris. She was already lost to the world of insanity when we moved into the neighborhood. Mr. Harris had moved out and started a new family, living only half a mile away. There were 6 kids in his family, 3 boys and 3 girls. Every Friday, Mr. Harris would come by with 2 brown bags of groceries. The 6 children would run to the car to greet him as if it were normal. I guess to them it was. Jazzy, the oldest child, was 12. She had to take care of her brother, sister, and mother. Some days in the peacefulness of dusk, when Jazzy had finished her chores, we sat on top of a dirt hill not far from our homes and put our imaginations to work. We observed the clouds, which we insisted were made of Martha White's self-rising flower, and imagined Volkswagens or a fairy prince coming to steal kisses from us, or elephants with baby angels sitting on top. I saw Jazzy years later at my mother's funeral. Since we had lost touch, I asked her how she knew my mom had passed. She said she saw it in the obituary section in the Birmingham News. She had to come because Mom had been so nice to them. Mom would sometimes give them lunch money and food, and Jazzy always loved her for that. I told her I never knew. I guess if another neighbor were writing this piece, they would write, over there in that yellow and white house lived the Tankersleys, Mr. and Mrs. Tankersley and their 3 children, Theo, Dana, and Kelly. Mrs. Tankersley doesn't work, and sometimes Mr. Tankersley works 3 jobs trying to take care of his family. She must think she's too good to work because she looks like a white woman. The children have to catch 2 city buses to go to that expensive Catholic school their parents send them to. Why can't they go to public schools like all the other children in the neighborhood? Do they think they're too good? Besides, that Catholic schoolgirl Dana was 3 months pregnant when she got married, so she's doomed to hell. Eventually, the airport expanded and purchased all the homes in Roseville Park. The neighbors scattered all over the city: Woodlawn, Norwood, Roebuck, Titusville. 3 decades passed before we had a reunion. My mother's funeral reunited all the neighbors: the Johnsons, the Fords, the Freemans, the Harrises, and the Tankersleys. The years had added gray hair, wrinkles, and weight. The most important thing time had given us was pride. Pride in who we were and pride in where we came from. We laughed, cried, and reminisced about the joys we shared living in Roseville Park.
Next up is Sophia Hansen. Sophia writes organically using no hormones, antibiotics, or pesticides on her words, unless it's absolutely convenient. She lived on a tiny island in Alaska, the bustling cities of New York and Boston, and has settled in the Southeast where she writes and edits in other worlds. She is an editor with Havoc Publishing, a flash fiction magazine, and her debut novel, Water's Break, was released early this January. Sophia loves plenty of coffee, crispy bacon, and that after 30 or more years of marriage, 7 children, and numerous pets, she can still fit into her high school earrings. Here with Leafbound, Sophia Hansen.
Hi, I'll be reading Leafbound, which was my second published flash fiction piece. Lorva was hungry. So very hungry, and alone. Suffocating darkness encased her. She was completely sealed in. Instinct overruled her uncertainty, and the gloom diffused as she gnawed the walls. Chomp, chew, gulp, smack, swallow. She emerged, surrounded by sickening sounds of others feeding. I'm not alone. This awareness wasn't comforting, but hunger drove her out. She crept into the murky grayness, jostling with the others, searching for food. She latched onto a leaf with her mandibles. Green! She chomped forward, squinting at vague forms around her. They moved with similar rhythm. Advance the rear, extend the front, eat everything in reach. Repeat. Lorva fed until darkness overtook her blurry world. She nestled under a half-eaten leaf, hooking on with her back legs. Safely anchored and a full stomach. This is good. She smiled as she drifted to sleep, still chewing in her dreams. Vibrations trembled down the branch, jiggling her awake. Lorva blinked rapidly at the morning light, waking to a voracious appetite. Must find more. Eat more. Her need grew relentless. Foraging consumed her days, and hunger haunted her nights. Finally, she was too stuffed to move. What now? Lorva clung to a leaf, trying to process all she'd ingested. Her flesh was uncontainable, bulging at each abdominal segment. A breeze wafted over her CT, sending waves of pain across the fine hairs. This hurts so much, but I need food. Is this all there is to life? Unceasing hunger and excruciating pain? Her head throbbed and she writhed in anguish. Suddenly, the skin between her antennae began to tear. Horrified at the rending, she held her breath. It stopped nothing. Section by section, outer membrane peeled away from soft flesh. Wind raked at her newly exposed skin. She shivered, shrinking from the rupturing layer. But as she shed, the pain began to recede. Lorva stepped out of the empty shell into new freedom, overcome with relief and renewed hunger. Weaving back and forth, she wriggled onto a new leaf. So good, she chomped eagerly, greedy in her renewed strength. Careful there, a smooth voice interrupted. You don't want to reduce that bush to a stem, do you? Lorva froze. What was this? Sounds? Words? Something other than chomping? Was this danger? Should she drop or stand? You, she swallowed a bit of leaf, shouldn't eat me. I won't taste good. I might even make you sick. She anchored her prolegs to the stem, drawing her front as high as she could. You don't say, the voice sounded amused at her warning. You'll be sorry if you eat me. I mean it. What bravery in such a tiny packet. An unexpected wind breathed from the direction of the voice. Was the voice laughing at her? Well, if you're mocking me, I guess you're not planning to eat me, Lorva sniffed. And if that's the case, I have better things to do. Actually, you do, the voice answered gently this time. I wanted you to know that. The gusts quickened and voice called from above. Save some of that bush for later. Humph. Lorva returned to feeding, ignoring the prickle of uncertainty that burrowed in her gut. That voice, what does it know? But it was nice to talk, to be heard. Lorva gorged, slept, and shed a few more times. She'd grown a lot, and each molt was more painful than the previous. She sighed at the familiar twinge of constricting skin. It was time. Is this all there is to my life? A cycle of stuffing and pain? What did voice mean? I have better things to do. Lorva dropped off the bush and shuffled away. Can't do this anymore. I'll bind my skin tight. I won't split again. Anchoring herself to a sturdy twig, she started to spin a cloak. If I make it strong enough, I won't have to. Good plan, but wrong idea. That you, voice? Lorva continued spinning. Voice? That's the best you could come up with? Voice chuckled, lighting upon Lorva's twig. It's not like you introduced yourself, Lorva huffed. Allow me to make amends, princess. I am Monarch, your humble servant. Well, Monarch, you mocked my beginnings, and you mock when I'm finished. All you do is make me question my existence. Now, when I'm quite sure my life has no value, have you come to seed my death with doubt? I'm full of pain, tired of these struggles, and quite prepared to die. Nay, princess, I've come neither to mock nor to watch you die. I'm here to wait with you. Monarch, I'm no princess, but you are the closest thing I have to a friend. You may wait while I finish my cloak. She encased herself painstakingly, weaving till she was wrapped up tight. She wouldn't split again. Lorva lost time, and then herself across the rising and setting suns. But in every awareness, however fleeting, Monarch was present. Sense and consciousness coalesced, and the familiar pain of constraint gripped her once again. A sob escaped as she struggled to free herself. I was wrong. You didn't know, Monarch whispered. The world spun as she wriggled furiously. I'm sorry, I'm not quite myself, Lorva staggered from her shroud, emerging with a last shake of her cloak as she stretched her wings. But you are. Now, welcome to your reign, fairy monarch. An ethereal creature fluttered before her, its gossamer wings shimmering, full of oranges and yellows and reds. Lorva had never seen such beauty. She hadn't seen anything but grays previously. This new vision was bursting with colors beyond imagining. She struggled to form words. Monarch, what? How? Why? You are our monarch fairy, charged to safeguard us from leaf to flight. But to tend us wisely, you needed to know our struggle. And now I can know your delight, Larva said. Let us fly. And with a leap, she danced into the air, full of joy, fully free.
Tiffany McNair wrote her first short story at the age of 12 and fully admits it was in need of major editing and character development. She channeled her love of writing into journalism during her school days, but never lost the passion and imagination for storytelling or freedom of expression found in poetry. Drawing inspiration from her favorite sport, Tiffany hopes to publish her first novel, a romantic sports thriller about the first female Major League Baseball club owner, by next year. When she's not working or listening to the characters in her head, you can find Tiffany reading, diamond painting, watching Boston sports teams, except the Patriots, with her husband, or loving on their rescue dog, Luna. Today, Tiffany shares a poem entitled Missing Persons. Nice touch, by the way. Appreciate it. This piece, as Sam said, is titled Missing Persons. My joy ran away with the circus, packing up like the big top, boarding a train, moving on to the next city, hopefully to return in a year. My joy spin itself, like a trip to Walmart, finding the clearance aisle and buying things that will inevitably end up in a closet, never to be thought of again, until next year's spring cleaning and put in the annual yard sale, where it will be sold for 50 cents. My joy drove away like kids of divorced parents on their dad's weekend, taking just enough stuff for a couple of days, so I know it'll be back, right? My joy was buried in a pine box 6 feet deep, surrounded by cement, where light cannot penetrate and my tears unable to soften the petrified earth to offer a path back to the surface. My joy melted. It was frozen to me at one point, strong and firm, like glaciers in my veins no climate change could reach. It built ice caves inside the chambers of my heart, fortifying itself, where the only feeling was happiness, and my despair flowed freely through solid arteries unallowed to bind and cause blockages. But I guess joy decided that the tundra was just too cold. Have you seen joy? Specifically mine? Joy looks like a trapeze artist making their connection after somersaulting through the air with no safety net. It looks like the juice of a tiger blood snow cone dripping down the chin of a 7-year-old, holding hands with your grandfather asking to see the acrobats again. It looks like Saturday nights in a college dorm room with just enough money in the bank to afford pizza and Twizzlers. The Breakfast Club playing in the background as 80-20-somethings dance around and punch their fists to the sky. It looks like a child returning home, to safety, to familiarity, to their friends on the street, hugging their mother hello and waving goodbye to their dad, not knowing he'll cry all the way back to his house, having just left his own joy with his ex-wife. But my joy, she doesn't look like she used to. She's like one of those crazy days in the South, hitting all 4 seasons in 24 hours and never making up her mind. She's a chameleon, changing her colors to blend in with the environment, staying hidden because of the unknown and never showing her true beauty. The fear of ridicule for being different, preventing her acceptance of self. We used to be friends, Joy and me. Like bail you out of jail, jump in a puddle after a hard rain, tip over a canoe just because you can kind of friend. I can't quite remember when Joy became more like a 6th cousin removed, but still coming to the family reunion kind of friend. I wish I could say we were the haven't seen or talked to each other in months or weeks, or can pick up right where we left off kind of friends. No,
Joy and I haven't conversed in quite a while. I truly don't know when she'll be back. Maybe I should make some missing person flyers and post them on telephone poles, community boards, and inside vinyl record shops. You see, the only problem with that is I just have a picture of me. Thank you.
Haley Moon is a novelist, short story writer, and blogger, and has recently released her debut novel, Taming Armand, book 1 of the Coven Origins series. She writes across the genres of horror, noir, fantasy, and science fiction. She publishes on her blog, The Weirdo Writes, and has published several stories on Vocal Media. When she's not writing, she's crocheting, playing with her cat Nubby, or searching out inspiration in the macabre. Here with the Dragon's Keeper, Haley Moon.
It smelled like dry skin and innocence, a small heirloom, and I rolled the chip of soap between my thumb and index fingers. It's one of the few things I have left of the time before. Many here have things, little tokens passed down through the years of their life on the surface, before the dragons and the comets. I have this bit of soap and an extension cord. Stephen had his great uncle's old folding square, something my great-grandmother called a laptop. But items such as those were few and far between. What usually followed was a glassy-eyed retelling of the old ways and something called an internet. It's hard to believe that there was a life before, but I was a believer. According to the elders, there weren't always dragons in the valley. It wasn't until after the turn of a new century, and only after man tamed his small backyard of the cosmos. The rise in the aerospace industry and the discovery of new fuel sources led man to believe he could command the heavens. Let thy will be done in heaven as it is on earth. It wasn't just a perversion of something referred to as the gospel. It wasn't just Helio Inc.'s motto. It was the mantra of our global society. There was a sense of unity and pride as those rockets launched, heading for the asteroid belt. We were mining, stomping around, nudging reserves of resources into place, creating unnatural orbits. We were our own gods. At the height of our hubris, the comet came, a drifter from deep space, reminding us we weren't in control. Some say it was a sign prophesied 4 millennia ago. Others believed it was a punishment from God for man's arrogance. Whatever you believe, none could argue against the shift in the seasons, nor the poisoning of 2/3 of the water. The elders tell of a sky that blazed bright orange, turning midnight into high noon. This false day lasted 15 minutes before knocking out power grids, plunging 2 continents into total darkness. An hour later, the rest of the world followed, and so did chaos. There was a war over the few resources that remained. Whoever controlled the water ruled the land, and battles once fought behind computer screens were now fought with bows, arrows, and homemade spears. This wormwood, as it was named, brought upheaval to our peace and fractured our global nation. When wormwood hit, 15 billion people were reduced to 6 in a matter of months. By the end of the year, that number dropped by more than half, and we lost contact with our moon colony. But in the midst of tragedy, something unexpected happened. The air and water became cleaner, and then came the dragons. It was during this 20-year war that these winged serpents came from below, seizing their opportunity, exploiting man's confusion and the chaos. They came from beneath the earth, out of the hole that wormwood formed many years before. The survivors of the fall claimed they were beasts from the pits of hell, the pets of the devil himself. As the 2 dragon clans battled for their right to reign, we built small enclaves, ending our war, and banding together, hoping to go unnoticed. We couldn't hide forever. They would not accept our existence. They didn't want us here. What wormwood didn't destroy, the children of Starcaster and Hadish purged with fire. Those of us left went underground. We were no longer welcome to walk the soil as we once had. When man could no longer rely on his technology, he turned to magic. Once dismissed as fairy tales had now become a way of life, of survival. The elders turned to old tomes and taught the young, thus giving rise to the mystics. The mystics were said to be the liaison between dragon and man, between this realm and the next. I sat reminiscing on the story my mother told me, just as her mother had told her. My focus shifted to the crowd forming. The men were jeering, even some of the women, at the head of the opaque dragon in the center of the large wooden table. Dante raised his hand high, silencing the excited crowd. "Bring the mystic, bring Gaia," he shouted, pointing at an old woman. She hurried, wobbling on a long steel pipe she used as a cane. "We will see once and for all. This is one of the devils, one of Starcaster's minions," he hissed, pulling on the decapitated head's horn. The older woman returned, Gaia following closely behind. She had changed since the last time I saw her. We used to play together up until she and I were 8. She was taken to study magic. Unlike me, Gaia had the mark, a keloid scar in the shape of a crescent moon behind her left ear. There was a hush over the hall as she approached. The slender, sienna-skinned girl placed her hand on the head, closing her eyes. We could feel her raw power, and many stepped back unsure of what to do. After nearly a minute, she snatched her hand back as if burned, locking blister-colored eyes onto the deep sage irises of Dante. "You killed the wrong one," she whispered, panicked. Dante and his men had killed many before, and never this reaction. There was never any fear, but something was different, and I moved closer. He laughed, looking around. "What do you mean? It's a dragon. It's one of those things, and we killed it." He grabbed her upper arm roughly. "Look again, child." He pushed her toward the table, and she stumbled. "I don't need to look again." Her voice was soft but strong. He approached, his bulky frame towering over her, and raised his hand. Gaia didn't shrink away, but stood straighter, the wool dress loosely cloaking her curvy figure. I admired her bravery. "That's Ganesh, one of Hadisha's children." Dante looked taken aback as his hand fell to his side. "Like I said, you killed the wrong one." She stepped away, looking at the crowd. "Hadisha will be angry. She has given us much, allowed us to hunt on the surface, as her children watch, providing protection." She pointed at the head. "Is this how we repay her generosity?" She looked around. Several people refused to meet her eyes. A man from the hunting party, Leo, spoke. "What does it matter? Hadish has many children. She doesn't need to know. Will she even miss this one? He's not that big." Several around him nodded in agreement. Others looked worried as they focused their attention back on the young teen. "Yes, it matters. He's a rainbow serpent, bringer of the rains during the droughts. The replenisher after the destroyers burn everything, and you killed him." Her eyes began to water, and she placed her hand over her mouth. Dante looked around. What does this child know? He used the chair to stand atop the table. "We have killed many of these beasts, so let Hadish come. We are not afraid." He boasted, and many of the young bloodthirsty men cheered in response. One of the old women, Baba, spoke as she rose on shaky legs. "She's a mystic. I believe the girl. I have seen what Hadish and her clan can do." She looked around. Many of the elders that remained silently nodded. Some looked forlorn as they remembered a time before the stability we enjoy now. "We were once at war with both Hadish and Starcaster, and together the two clans almost wiped out all of us." She pointed at her chest before waving her wrinkled hand toward the others. "We entered into a truce with Hadish. We agreed to only kill children of her enemy, and in return she granted us permission to come to the surface twice each season to hunt, and has allowed us to keep 5 above to grow and harvest crops during the growth season. I doubt now if she will continue to honor that truce, given what has been done." I watched Dante, my father, as the woman spoke. I could tell by the way his shoulders were drawn upward he was tense, his forehead wrinkled in worry. This fragile balance between humans and dragons was now broken. I feared for my father. This infraction would not go unpunished, and if a sacrifice was required by the murderous serpent, then my father, if not my mother and myself, would be offered up by the council as penance. Now, elders of the council, she looked around, her eyes cold, her grin menacing. We know what must be done. Thank you.
Charles Smith is a retired advertising executive that lives in Birmingham. Smith was born March 19, 1943 in Grenada, Mississippi. He's a 1961 graduate of Robert E. Lee High School in Montgomery and a 65 graduate of Auburn University, where he majored in commercial art and advertising. He grew up living all over the Deep South states, including Mississippi, Louisiana, Florida, Georgia, and finally Alabama, where he was active in sports including baseball, football, and track and field. He was a 2-time state champion pole vaulter and a 2-year track and field letterman at Auburn University. In addition to the Alabama connection, he has authored 5 fiction novels. Today, Mr. Charles will be sharing poems from Spring Leaves.
Spring Leaves, this is my sketch for the cover. It'll be out in about a month. It's a compilation of poems, blogs, and short stories. And I don't have the books yet, but I have a sign-up sheet if anybody wants to reserve one. Spring Leaves. There's a metamorphosis taking place as the snow melts at a faster pace. The cycle of life surrounds us all as the temperatures rise and fall. Then you can hear it in the air, the sounds of singing birds everywhere. Winter fades and fades away, and the spring leaves are on the way. Tiny flower buds burst before our eyes as the April showers fall from the skies. Then like magic the flowers bloom, each one destined to decorate a room. Pollen covers everything in sight, and baby birds begin to take flight. Easter is here with all its glory, reminding us of life's most amazing story, of how our King was hung on a tree and how he died in agony. Now we see the meaning of the cross as it looms bigger within our thoughts. God's creation is vividly displayed, for the tomb is empty where Jesus was laid. Easter with all its colors has arrived, and it's our signal that Christ is alive. It's a beautiful scenario that God weaves, all written within the spring leaves. A story for the ages. For 2,000 years, the news has spread in the greatest book ever read. Many lives have been spent just recording the event. A story of how the world was changed and how time was rearranged. A story of silver and gold and countless legends ever told. A story of shepherds and kings bearing gifts and treasured things. A bright star led their way to see the miracle in the hay. From near and far they came to see God's gift for you and me. They came to see the baby Jesus, the King that came to free us. As the angels hovered over the sheep, the infant Messiah was sound asleep. A story for the ages. Is it a rock? I looked down to see it lying by my shoe. Was it there long before it came into view? Is it the rock shepherd David chose? Could be, but only God knows. Has it detached from a cliff or boulder? Was it tossed over someone's shoulder? Is it a meteorite that fell from the stars? Was it larger but run over by cars? Is it a rock? God placed it here so we might say it should be left to lay where it is today. Should I look away and ignore? Did it wash here from a distant shore? Do rocks get lonely as they lie around? And is it an important part of this town? Could it be the Rock of Ages, once immortalized by ancient sages? Can it hear me when I speak? All these answers I will seek. Is it just a rock? Has it been kicked out of place by an athlete finishing a race? Did it fall off the Rock of Gibraltar? Is it an ancient remnant of a sacrificial altar? Was it the inspiration for the band that played "On Christ, the solid rock I stand"? Should I leave it alone and walk on by? Is there more coming from the sky? Is it a talisman with a history, a sacred stone, a holy mystery? Is it just a rock? Jesus' sandaled foot may have walked by. If so, surely I must let it lie. Is it a chip off the old block, and the meme hard as a rock? Was it part of our planet's birth, the solid material that formed the earth? Is it here to be used to decorate? But who am I to speculate? Is it just a rock? Does it have blood on it shed in war? And was it used to make a scar? Whose eyes have seen it, I could ask, but is it my duty to take the task? Has it been trampled by hooves of horses, crushed by chariots on ancient race courses? What history has it seen we might implore? And does it have an exciting life in store? Is it just a rock? No, it's not just a rock or hard dirt clod. It's a unique creation made by our God. God invented you. On a slow day in heaven with little to do, God created what he called you. He formed you in an image like him, no doubt muscular and slim. An amazing arrangement of body parts, including a magical thing he called a heart. A body covered with what God called skin, and equipped with a device like all men. The skin protects you from the rain. Then he gave you what he called a brain. The brain was encased in what he called a head, with a system of veins with blood that runs red. He topped you off with what he called hair, including a trait that one day becomes bare. Then God could see you was not complete. You needed someone to make him compete. God gave you someone who will aggravate. God created you a mate. A casket draped in old glory, dedicated to all the soldiers in all the wars. A casket draped in old glory. It's a place soldiers may be, for it could be their destiny. They go off to a faraway land, all armored up to make a stand. To make a stand for us, you know, because we're too afraid to go. All just kids not long off their bike. They quickly learn what hell is like. They're all trained to do one thing to a man, to kill if necessary with one hand. Heroes they are for sure. Obstacles galore they have to endure. Before they even know where they are, they find themselves embroiled in a war they didn't choose, but they are told they can't lose. A responsibility dumped onto them upon their shoulders by officers with a whim. Just young shoulders, just young soldiers. Then one day they come home, you see, in a casket draped in old glory. Gravity is trying to kill me. In my younger days, I tried to defeat it, as vaulting was my sport for a bit. Now it's come back for revenge, you see. It appears gravity is trying to kill me. An invisible nuisance that keeps pulling at you, making you feel heavier than you really do. More than once it's tricked me with a fall. It's an invisible force that lurks near us all. It takes advantage of things that trip your feet, and it may distract your eyes with a treat. Listen to this warning I must implore, or you may end up on the floor. I beseech you to take heed, or down you'll go with lightning speed. Look behind you, watch what you do, for gravity may be stalking you. Watch for obstacles that take you down. Its power can change a smile to a frown. Up a hill, down the steps, to the left or right. Beware, for it hides in plain sight. Gravity is trying to kill me. 2 minutes. Over the hill, a wise old man advised me long ago, you'll cross a hill before you go. Yes, over the hill before eternal sleep. Beware, the incline may be steep. He warned you may come down fast when the end comes at last. He offered, you'll know you're over the hill when everything you do requires a pill. With pain from your head to your toe, it's your memory that's first to go. The old man looked sadly into my eyes, and I knew he was saying his goodbyes. Then he choked and struggled to say, I'll be there on your final day. And when you cross your finish line, you can't look back to the hill behind.
Up next is my fabulous coworker, Sean DeArmond. Sean is a fiction writer with one foot perpetually dancing through the realm of fantasy and the other stuck in the dried concrete of adult responsibility. His portfolio includes short stories, poems, song lyrics, entertainment reviews, general backbiting, and the occasional non sequitur. Today, he reads his new short story, Simply Human, a tale of connection that attempts to find meaning in the mundane, but settles for coming in under the word count's cutoff. Up next, Sean.
I think this is my 12th or 13th flash fiction event, and this was the first time I signed up with nothing. But as all writers know, if you let your muses know you have a deadline, they'll talk to you. Miss Sheila arrived at her storytime room early, slipping into the back where her co-worker, Mr. Bronson, was just finishing up. And when she awakened, she saw 3 pairs of eyes staring at her, and she dove out the window and never came anywhere near the house again. He adjusted his glasses for effect. The moral, don't be like Goldilocks. And the children giggled. Mr. Bronson was a large man, perhaps intimidating at first, but the children loved him. He thumped the book shut, and on cue, his young audience hopped up to either scramble straight to the door or give his legs a quick hug first. And then it was quiet. You're so good with them, Sheila laughed. I keep it simple. They let them see what they want to see. Odd, though, for a folk tale, most of them actually do have morals. Goldilocks doesn't really have one. Does if you're a bear. And Mr. Bronson lumbered past her to give her space. Sheila nearly let him go, but at the last second blurted out the words she tried to pretend like she hadn't been rehearsing. Do you want to get a drink? A drink? Yeah, I mean, not right now, obviously. You know, I thought, after work, we see each other every day, and it might be nice. And the predicate never arrived, but it was okay because Mr. Bronson was lost in thought. Yeah, okay. You seem harmless. And a few hours later, the two of them were sitting next to each other at a bar a few blocks away with just enough rum and coke to ebb the co-workers outside of work awkwardness that always seems to accompany real human contact. Sheila found herself stuck on Goldilocks as the conversation topic, but Mr. Bronson, whose first name she had yet to learn, showed enough interest to keep it flowing. See, I quite like the character. Yeah, she's trespassing and technically a thief, but she did things, and I just kind of admire that courage. Is that really courage or just stupidity? It's complicated. I mean, when you're a child, you don't really know what you can't do. You have a fearlessness, you explore, you jump into creeks that you can't see the bottom of, and you don't worry about broken glass or snakes, and you wander in the woods and you don't mind getting lost because you're, I guess, too dumb to really think about consequences. Sometimes I miss being dumb. Isn't that the price of longevity? Yeah, but it was simple. It felt more alive back then. Now I feel like we're living longer and we're afraid of everything. Would you like to hear a story? Seriously? A story from me to you. Yeah, all right. All right. It was an ordinary day in the woods. Fish swam, birds flew, snakes did snake things. It was simple. And everyone could accept that. And they could also accept that one day they might die, probably from an animal bigger or fiercer than they were. But one day, this group of monkeys decided they couldn't accept it. So they built a new woods, where they were the biggest and the fiercest animal. Now, mind you, they didn't actually change size, but they began to function as this swarm. Now, to the other animals, this was the biggest and fiercest thing they had ever seen, and they learned to stay away from the monkeys. So as time went on, the monkeys felt safe, pretty certain that tomorrow was going to be there for them. Now, as they got comfortable with the idea of tomorrow, they got stuck on the notion that there was a way to make tomorrow better for them. Unfortunately, each individual monkey had a different idea about what better was. And the woods they had built became complicated. Now, the old woods did its best to keep a distance, but that swarm was everywhere. And it came as a real surprise to the animals that the monkeys had developed this romantic idea of what the old woods was. They imagined the great folk wisdom lay within the old woods, and they told stories about the old woods and the animals, and they treated this very thing that they'd originally had such disdain for with bizarre reverence. And every once in a while, a lone monkey would sneak into the old woods and ask for guidance to help them understand the now excessively complicated new woods that its own swarm had built. And the damnedest thing is, the monkey always seemed to get an answer. The old woods didn't understand it. It had no wisdom for it. The only wisdom the old woods had was the knowledge that one day, tomorrow forthcoming, the new woods would be the only woods. And if these monkeys couldn't figure out how to live in it, what the hell kind of chance do the other animals have? Yeah, best not tell that one to the kids. They finished off their drinks, chatted a bit longer before accepting the inevitable that it was getting late-ish. Responsible adult on a weeknight late. Mr. Bronson had walked over from the workplace, and Sheila insisted on giving him a lift back. Obviously, nobody was going to mess with him, but dusk in the city is dangerous for anybody. She pulled up to the first red light and smiled to herself. This was nice. Mr. Bronson quietly nodded in agreement. Nice and simple. But the niceness didn't last. The flashing lights in her rearview mirror made certain to stamp all over that moment. A few seconds later, a police officer was at her window with a flashlight in her face. Excuse me, ma'am. Have you been drinking? Yes, I assure you I am under the limit. And where are you headed? I'm just taking my coworker back to his car. And your coworker is Ma'am, I'm gonna need you to step out of the car right now. What? No, I am under the limit. But the cop was already on his radio. Yeah, I'm gonna need backup and get animal control. There's a crazy drunk woman with a bear in her car. What is he talking about? She turned to Mr. Bronson for some help making sense of it. But all he did was remove his glasses and say, "This just got complicated."
Octavia Karansky has only recently entered the fantasy world of writing. She writes short fiction in the noir literary tradition. She has 4 short stories and 3 poems in print, including publication in the Alabama Writers Collective and Jefferson State Community College's annually published anthology Wingspan. Here with The Last American Hero, Octavia Karansky.
Looks different from up here. I want to thank Sam for doing such a fabulous job. You didn't have to, and you did it anyway. So thank you. He lay in the tent, some obtrusion poking a pain into his back. Had he not been alone, he would have confided that he was glad it hurt. It distracted him enough to quiet the echo of the latest argument. And further, had he not been alone, he would have voluntarily confessed, despite the gift of pain, he could not totally dismiss the incident that put him in the tent with the obtrusion in his back and in need of the distraction. In the earlier occurring and admittedly worrying incident, he had been dangerously ready to admit to some wrongdoing just to get some peace. But now, this admission helped him to see what he believed the true nature of the incident was, a test, the test. This belief was informed from having studied his beloved war movies, especially those scenes of torture. In his imagined versions of himself in such situations, he lasted the longest of anyone under any possible arrangement of duress, never having given over any secrets, and because of his tenacity, later held up in history books as the hero, the only true hero, for having endured. You should never correct your story while sitting in the cafe just before reading. Once he had allowed himself for a moment to muse, what was so hard? The pain? He knew pain. For years he had chosen not to remember why he knew pain so intimately, but he remembered that he had met it, subdued it, and in his self-scripted narrative, having saved the nation by never having given in to proffered relief from pain. In his imagination, he was even justified, including the possible receipt of a Purple Heart pinned to his chest by the President of the United States himself, acknowledged at last for his courage, his valor, his value. This prophetic biography had played out before his eyes during the barrage of accusations and complaints she had spit in his face once again in the aforementioned incident, but in the end, he had admitted to nothing, proof of his ability to meet any test. None of this vital information, however, made an appearance during the incident. All that mattered, apparently, was that he had hurt her somehow. This part was confusing, it really was. He tried so hard, getting married to make her happy, going to work every day, mowing the lawn. He had tried on so many roles, so much theater complete with outfits, suits for the office, stiff appropriate attire for her, high-end friends, dinner parties, all to be acceptable to her, to please her. So what if he smoked a little weed with the boys, had a few beers on a work night, looked at pretty women, took a little something for himself? This was wrong, but they had been over this. A million times they had been over this. This time she had thrown down a pile of clothes at his feet, the familiar outfits for his roles, ignoring more yelling from that heart-shaped mouth that had fascinated him like no other and thrust him up to her and her needs. He had snatched up a handful from the pile, gently pushed past her and out through the kitchen door, making certain he closed it behind him calmly, quietly. There was no need to argue with women, slam doors, engage in drama outside the real playhouse of war. "You're a drunk," she had yelled, "a good-for-nothing drunk, and you're silly." The arguments had never gone this far before. He usually escaped to the spare bedroom, and now, outside in the thin skin of night, there was a question as to what to do, where to go. He decided to go nowhere. Yes, that would be great. In fact, the middle of nowhere would be great. In the garage, he collected an old tent and some cookout tools. These he threw into the truck bed and drove all night to a nature preserve. The two of them had once spent the night at this preserve. They were better then. They had kissed and dreamed the same dream. He threw the simple tent together and blanket on the ground. It occurred to him to sleep in the truck stretched across the back seat, but sleeping on the ground seemed to him more fitting now. Perhaps, a message would be given him through osmosis from the mossy earth, or sprinkled down upon him through the leaf-filtered air as to what to do, some insight as to how to proceed. He thought of cutting off the top of the tent so he could see through it to the night sky. He was glad he had drunk only a few foamy steins that day and no whiskey. It showed his discipline. And this small nod to his true self was the last thing he remembered. It was days before his body was found. One of the park rangers noticed an unusually large swarm of fruit flies. His body had been ravaged by all manner of animal, although the actual cause of death, the coroner established later, was a blow to the head. The hammer used to inflict the fatal blow now lay innocently at the scene next to some extra pikes for staking the tent. "How did he get here?" one of the rangers queried. The truck he had driven was long gone, leaving no trail. The gentle moss had closed up and covered all. "What was he doing here?" another asked, noting an odd scattering of office jackets and baseball caps. Questions for an investigation. But meanwhile, fruit flies continued to feast on the yeast left on his lips from the last beer.
Bobby Matthews. Bobby is a novelist and short story writer whose work explores the dark and desperate underpinnings of the modern South. His novels include Living the Gimmick and Magic City Blues, and his short story Negative Tilt, which won the 2023 Derringer Award for Best Long Story. Living the Gimmick was named the best novel released in Alabama for 2022 by the Alabama Media Professionals, an organization which also named his story The Ghost of Buxahatchee Creek as the best short story penned in the state for that same year. The Ghost of Buxahatchee Creek was also recognized by the National Federation of Presswomen as one of the top short stories of the year. Bobby's latest book is a collection of short stories called Negative Tilt, and it will be released 3 days from now. He lives in Hoover, where he helps coach baseball and procrastinates on a near-professional basis. It is my pleasure to present to you Bobby Matthews.
Hey guys, so before I get started, I want to say how important events like this are for writers and communities and the people who support writers. Libraries are under attack in this state by a lot of people who don't want books accessible to people who may want and need them. So I would just say, please support your local library and the people like Sam who do incredible work. With that said, I have a book coming out This Tuesday, available wherever books are sold. Negative Tilt is a book of short stories, and I'm going to read something a little different. A lot of people who hear me usually expect some blood and guts, and this time I wanted to give you guys something with a little heart to it. If I can get this thing to open back up. It's called Visitation at 9. Kelly stood alone, greeting mourners, covertly casting glances down the line as people moved on. 50 yards away in the sanctuary of this cavernous city block of a church, her father lay in his casket, while Kelly was stuck with the macabre duty of receiving visitors before they laid him to rest. She recognized me during one of those long gray looks, and I wanted to crawl away. The weight gain and the hair loss, 2 decades of physical erosion, didn't matter. She knew it was me. According to his obituary, Conrad Gilpin was 84 when he died, although he'd been an old man as long as I could remember. Mr. Gilpin didn't walk the halls of the high school where he'd taught AP English. He shuffled. White-haired and stoop-shouldered, he never raised his voice. He didn't have to. His quiet sarcasm cut down a classroom troublemaker more viciously than a shout. His daughter had once been my closest friend, back when I was a half-formed human being in the primordial ooze of a public school, the unreliable narrator of my own life. As my friend, Kelly was long-suffering. She made apologies for my behavior when I didn't know how to make them myself. The mourners trudged forward, one slow step at a time. Andrew Snodgrass, who had sent me the obit 2 days before, elbowed me in the ribs and put his lips to my ear. "I don't see your husband. Do you?" I looked around and shook my head. "I don't," I whispered back, "but I only met the guy once. How would I know?" Andrew shrugged, and we moved up a space as Kelly finished with one well-wisher, and the endless conveyor belt of mourners rolled forward. Ice-cold air conditioning prickled my skin while the Alabama summer boiled away uselessly outside the car. It was 10 minutes until 9 a.m. and already 87 degrees, and the temperature was climbing. If I shut the car off, I'd have to go in. I'd see people that I'd known a long time ago, but they wouldn't know me. They would know the boy I'd been, half-formed but full of certainties. They wouldn't know the man who had replaced the boy, who had traded the cockiness and surety of a teenager for the doubts and insecurities of middle age. I texted Andrew. Made it, sitting in the side lot. The church was huge, with multiple parking lots, so I had to specify where I had parked. "Want to wait for me?" he wrote back. Andrew was a son of a bitch in high school, but like me, he'd become something different as an adult, something kinder and fuller than who he used to be. "We'll see," I texted back, knowing full well that I'd wait. It would be easier to go inside behind a shield. When Andrew wheeled into the lot, I stepped out of the rental car, beeped the locks, and ambled over. We faced each other across 10 feet of soft asphalt in a wellspring of long years. He still had all of his hair, the bastard. I stuck out my hand for him to shake. "The hell with that," he said. "I'm going to hug your neck." So we hugged, a curious thing for grown men who only know each other through social media. But it was comforting, too. Inside the church, the sanctuary was high-ceilinged with a pair of chandeliers, one above the pulpit and one above the long middle pews. It hung like burned-out constellations in the empty, cavernous space. Stained glass windows illuminated the room with refracted light. I'd spent many Sundays there, and the weight of the memories made me feel small and compacted. The casket lay in front of the altar, the lid propped open. I didn't want to go near the coffin, didn't want to see the grotesquerie of Conrad Gilpin's body laying there. But Andrew spotted Jennifer Sanders, a girl we'd both known, and sometimes lusted after, when we were young, and he drifted down toward the coffin with her. I trailed along in their wake like a piece of flotsam in the tide. Close up, the body didn't look like the man I'd known. I'd been to enough funerals by then to know that it never does. When I was young, people would look down at the body in the box and say things like, "He looks like he could just get up and talk, don't he?" But it wasn't true then, and it isn't true now. A dead body looks like a dead body, and whatever makeup and skills the morticians use can never erase the fact that the spark of life is simply gone from the husk we leave behind. For a long moment we said nothing because there was nothing to say. Conrad Gilpin had been a good man, had taught us the basic rules of English grammar and encouraged us to read and write and think. Never forget that part. Critically, his influence on me was reason enough to make the 3-hour trip from Birmingham. We retreated from the body, and then Jennifer left us. She was helping Kelly's family, of course. In times of need, Jennifer would pitch in for just about anyone. Andrew and I found a place to sit on one of the cushioned pews in the middle of the sanctuary, not too far back and certainly not too close to the front where the family would be seated. "We did some terrible things in this building," Andrew said, his voice low so as not to disturb the folks sitting around us. It made me smile. "I won't talk about it if you won't," I said, and that made him snicker quietly. An usher came forward with the solicitous manner of funeral directors everywhere, asking if we were members of the family. Yes, I could have said, a lifetime ago. Instead, Andrew and I shook our heads. We weren't family. After all this time, without contact, without even any kind of word from Kelly, we weren't really friends either. The best I could have told the man was that we were witnesses. We'd witnessed Kelly growing up, witnessed her wedding, and now we were here to witness her father's funeral. By the time those words occurred to me, Andrew had already replied that we were former students of Mr. Gilpin. The usher told us where the family was receiving visitors and added that he was sure they'd be happy to see us. He was much more positive about it than me. But after a moment, Andrew and I rose and walked out of the sanctuary, down a long hall that had not existed when we'd gone to church here, and found ourselves at the back of a line of well-wishers, mourners, and witnesses like ourselves. It was Andrew's turn in line. I had stepped back deliberately, letting him go before me, putting his body between Kelly and me. Stalling. What could I say to someone I'd once known so well? Someone who, once she got married, cut me and nearly all of her friends out of her life as neatly as clipping a coupon from a newspaper. A few warm comments passed between Andrew and Kelly, and then he moved on down the line to share his condolences with others in the family. Kelly turned her cornflower-colored eyes to me and smiled. "Paul," she said, and reached forward and hugged me with no hesitation at all. "It's so good of you to come." Up close, it was easier to read the passage of time on her face. Little crow's feet peeked shyly out at the corners of her eyes, and small lines drew down at the corners of her mouth. Her eyes were pink and puffy where she'd been crying. We looked at each other without saying all of the things that needed to be said. "I'm sorry for your loss," I managed. My throat felt close and hot. "Your dad was such a good man." What else was there to say? We locked eyes and our joined silence spun out a beat too long. We didn't know each other anymore. I'd been out of her life far longer than I'd ever been in it, and whatever had passed in those intervening years had made us strangers. In one world, the one in which we both lived and breathed, the awkward moment lasted only a couple of seconds. Anyone witnessing it wouldn't have given it a second thought. But somewhere else, in some universe where time has no meaning, where an hour or a day or a second or a year is all the same thing, I could sense that she knew everything that I wanted to say. In that place without time, we would go on speaking without words for eternity. "Well," Kelly said at last, "it's good to see you." "Yes," I said, "it's good to see you too. I'm sorry it wasn't under happier circumstances. Take care of yourself." And with that, I moved on down the line. I caught up to Andrew at the far end of the room. He was standing with a bearded guy and a pair of tall young men who were fighting the good fight against acne and losing. I stuck out my hand to the man with the beard. "I'm Paul," I said. "Pleased to meet you," he said. "I'm Will." "Oh," I hadn't meant to say anything, but he'd startled the word out of me. "Will, of course, Kelly's husband." He'd put on pounds around the middle, hadn't we all, and lost some hair on top. His bushy black beard made him look more fierce than I remembered, and then before I could rein in my tongue. We met before, one time, actually, at Kelly's wedding. I paused. Andrew paused. So did Will. And the two young, tall men beside him. Into the silence I blurted, "Oh, of course, I guess it was your wedding, too." Andrew's glib smoothness was no help at all. There was no handhold anywhere, no crack in the rock of this mountain of mortification where I could jam my hand into the crease all the way up to the wrist like a python of bone and stop this hurtling plunge. This was worse than the time I'd confused the anatomical term philtrum, the divider space under the human nose, for another anatomical term, frenulum, which is the underside of the head of a penis. I drew in a breath. If I could survive that embarrassment, I could survive this one. Yeah, Will said dryly. It was my wedding, too. He introduced me to the tall young men beside him, Kelly's sons, and his too, naturally. They had his height and her complexion so that they looked slightly wind-chapped even though we were in the apotheosis of summer. I shook their hands and smiled my empty smile at them. I learned there was a third boy, but he had enlisted in the Marines and was unable to attend the funeral. He was just as unreal to me as the two boys who were present. When she moved to Clarksville, things changed. The phone calls, nearly daily rituals between us, dried up. She had finally been hired as a kindergarten teacher and worked long hours in the classroom, getting things just right. At night I would call and the phone would ring and ring and ring. I thought about driving up. I should have driven up, but North Tennessee is a long way from South Alabama. The phone was easier. I thought the phone was enough. I didn't get an invitation to the wedding. In those days, the only mail I got was overdue notices from credit card companies and student loan people. I looked for an invitation every day as the year went on. None ever came. I read the engagement announcement in the paper. Mr. and Mrs. Conrad Gilpin announced the engagement of their daughter Kelly to Will whatever his name was. I stared at their picture for a long time before I read the announcement. It gave the date and the place and the time for the wedding. Would I go? Of course I would. Invitation or no, Kelly had meant too much for me to miss it. I don't know, Jacob Reeser told me before the ceremony. I don't think it's a good idea. I'd known Jacob as long as I'd known Kelly. Jacob's father had money, and so he'd been able to go to the Tony Private College along with Kelly. While she'd gotten a degree in early childhood education, Jacob had majored in Bible. I was majoring off and on and getting laid, occasionally with the helping of journalism on the side. You're probably right, I said. We sat on the tailgate of his pickup truck in the parking lot at the town's library, about 3 blocks from the church. Jacob was wearing a summer weight suit, which was about the only formal outfit a man should wear in the Alabama heat. I had on navy blue slacks and a rust-colored tweed jacket. Sweat pooled at my armpits and the small of my back. My hair hung wet and limp over my forehead. I heard he's a real jerk, Jacob said. Jen said Kelly wanted to lose weight for the wedding, but the guy wouldn't even let her go to a co-ed gym. He got her a membership at an all-women's gym. Huh, I said. And I was driving through there on my way back up to Wilmore, going to visit some friends. I asked her if I could sleep on her couch if I got tired on the road, and that was a no-go, let me tell you. Complete non-starter. Will wouldn't like it. Well, I wasn't planning on forcing myself on her. I just wanted to use the couch for the night. In the sanctuary, we found our seats. The sweat on my forehead dried while the organist played. Will and a few groomsmen slipped into the sanctuary from a side door and stood near the altar while the pastor took center stage. Jennifer Sanders was the first bridesmaid to enter, her slim figure clad in a pale peach dress, hair pulled back in an intricate chignon. When she turned to come down the center of the aisle of the church, everyone gasped at how visibly pregnant she was. More bridesmaids came out, but they were insignificant. I didn't know them and didn't care to. The music halted for the space of a moment, and we all rose to our feet as the first strains of the bridal march played. Kelly was beautiful. Her blonde hair had been further highlighted and piled atop her head in a convoluted tower held together with a combination of bobby pins and aquanet. Baby's breath blossoms shone in her hair like a tiara. She wore a lace veil that did nothing to hide her beauty, but instead magnified it. Her milky white shoulders were bare and toned. Whatever gym she had gone to had worked its magic. Her figure was a perfect hourglass, sheathed in white. The train of her dress spread out behind her, and 2 small children held it at either corner. Mr. Gilpin was beside her, and the force of his happiness and pride was warm and radiant. Kelly had to step carefully in her dress so her slow pace matched the shuffle of her father's walk. A lump formed in my throat as she approached the altar. I didn't understand why. When the music ended, I sat down and was glad that Jacob sat beside me. The preacher began to talk, and I tuned out until I heard the phrase, "If anyone here objects to this couple being joined in holy matrimony, speak now or forever hold your peace." Kelly picked that moment to make eye contact with me. There was a pleading in her eyes that I couldn't read. Did she want me to stand up? Had she been waiting for me all this time, for all these years that we had known and cared for each other? Or was it askance of a different sort? She had made her choice, so maybe the pleading was simply that I stay put and not make a damn fool out of myself, nor a farce out of her wedding. Beside me, Jacob gripped my arm so tightly that his knuckles were white. I tried to shrug away, but he kept his hold. We looked at each other, then I shook my head at him. I wasn't going to do anything. He dropped his hand, and the still quiet silence of that moment for an objection spun on like the elastic and perfectly sad moment after a child's heart drops on Christmas morning when all the toys have been opened. Later on at the reception, Will made a big production of lifting Kelly's skirt and sliding a white garter down her thigh, standing up afterward and twirling it around his index finger while the guests laughed. Tradition called for the uncoupled young men to try to catch the garter, and so we gathered in the foyer of the fellowship hall. Jacob and I found ourselves pushed toward the front of a rowdy, laughing group of overgrown boys. On the second floor landing, Will held Kelly's garter taut on his left index finger and pulled it back hard with his right hand. He snapped the garter right at me, and I plucked it from the air. It was decorated with white and pink roses. Around us, the party whooped with delight. Will nodded curtly at me, and I returned the gesture. That is Visitation at 9, and if you like this, there are plenty of stories like this in my next collection that comes out on Tuesday.
Our final presentation this afternoon comes from our special guest, Jim Nesbitt. Jim has the perfect face for radio, a bad knee that can grind coffee beans and tell time, and an ancient cat who poaches his cigars and uses his cell phone to place bets on British soccer. He is a lapsed horseman, pilot, and saloon sport with a keen appreciation for old guns, vintage cars, red meat, good cigars, aged whiskey without an E, and a well-told story. He is also the award-winning author of 4 hard-boiled Texas crime thrillers that featured battered but relentless Dallas PI Ed Earl Birch. For more years than he cares to remember, Nesbitt was a journalist who chased hurricanes, earthquakes, presidential candidates, neo-Nazis, and nuns, with an eye for the telling detail and an ear for the people who give life to a story. A diehard Tennessee Volunteers fan, he now lives in enemy territory, Athens, Alabama, and is working on his 5th Ed Earl Birch novel, The Fatal Saving Grace. Under the right circumstances, he's been known to preach the gospel of hard-boiled crime fiction. Without further ado, Jim Nesbitt.
See if I can make it. Thanks a lot. It's good to be here, and I want to thank Bobby and Sam for letting me crash in on the reg group. And I love doing these events, and a couple of events closer to home that I used to do either folded their tent or the guy running them has quit. So I'm now find myself looking for a new home. I want to echo or drop the other shoe what Bobby was mentioning about the importance of events like this and the people like Sam who put them on. They're a tonic for writers. You know, we're in our little hovels and caves, struggling away, writing away, scribbling, and we don't get out very much, except for Bobby. He's out all the time. But, you know, we don't see people. And then when we come to an event like this and meet folks who actually love reading words, whether it's our words or somebody else, it really is a tonic and boosts your spirits. get you ready to do the next work. So I'll quit preaching on that point. I won't quit preaching about hardball crime thrillers like this one. It's my latest, The Dead Certain Doubt. It just picked up a Independent Press Award bauble for Best Crime Fiction of 2024, and it does feature a rather raucous guy named Ed Earl Birch. He's not too well housebroken, and he's really not your sharpest knife in the drawer in terms of detectives. He's not Sam Spade, but he is relentless, and he believes in chasing people down no matter how many rules he has to break to make that happen. In this book, he's trying to make amends to a woman he turned his back on decades ago, and she's got one last request to find her granddaughter, which is not as easy as it sounds. His granddaughter has she had a kind of rough and rowdy teenage years, but now is ex-girlfriend of a gun runner, and she's taken up gun running herself. She's being chased by rival cartels down on the Mexican border, and he's trying to convince her to give up that life and before she winds up getting killed. So I'm going to read you the first chapter. Since we've been sitting here for a long time, I'm going to make this short and sweet. The scream stopped them in their tracks, frozen in mid-stride by the cresting, falling walls of a terrified creature in deep pain, carried on the harsh night wind as it slid up and down the scale of torment, rage, and fear. They listened, adrenaline surging, hearts slamming a staccato, senses filtering out the rushing current of cold, and the answering cries of coyotes pinpointing the location of agony's call. A death song in the dark. It didn't sound human, but they knew it was. And they knew where it came from, the darkened ranch house down below. Without a glance or a word, they stepped out of the moonlit middle of the steep dirt track they were descending and into the shadows of the rocky wall that loomed above them. They even knew who it was. Not a guess, a certainty. They listened. Seconds seemed like hours. The screams stopped. Sticking to the shadows, they edged down the shoulder of the track, feet slipping in the loose rock and gravel, each cursing silently as they stopped to listen again. Nerves taut, they reached a spot that overlooked the house, then crossed the track to a boulder that gave them cover. Close enough to see that flicker of flashlights and hear laughter and low voices and the bang of metal on metal. A whisper in her ear, a rank puff of stale cigarette smoke and sour coffee in her nostrils. We close enough to hear them, they're close enough to hear us. She nodded, then tightened the scratchy wool scarf that covered her nose and mouth and pulled the black felt resistol a little lower over her bottled blonde hair. They watched and listened. They heard the chop of metal on meat, the sound of the butcher shop, not the wood pile, then the low guttural laughter of men sharing a task they couldn't see. Engines cranking then catching, rumbles deep and uneven, smoothing out as drivers wrapped the pipes, then let the revs die down. Running lights popping on, outlining the dark forms of their backcountry rigs, jacked up and sporting spotlights and chrome roll bars that reflected the amber beams. Then the deeper roar of a larger rig, a humpback beast with waddling out of the deep darkness behind the house, back where the barn stood that served as storage for lethal product headed south. A 6x6, mill surplus, or stolen from the Mexican army, maybe a loaner from a corrupt colonel or general. There go the guns and ammo, she thought, our guns and ammo. Kiss our moneymaker bye-bye. Panic shattered the farewell, fatal if these machines headed their way, but they didn't. In trail, the three rigs and the bigger beast rolled toward the far end of the mesa and the gravel switchbacks that led miles of rough ranch road and to the highway beyond. They watched and listened until the beast slipped over the distant edge and the sound of the engines faded away. Rhonda May heard him let out a long breath and mutter to himself in Spanish. Armando reached out into his coat and pulled out a pack of delicados. He shook out 2 unfiltered nails, lit them both with a big knockoff, and handed one to her. She nodded a thanks and took a deep drag of strong, honest smoke. Delicate this ain't, usually amused by the machos who puffed a tough guy brand with such a feminine name. Not tonight, though. Her lover was dead. His scream still echoed in her head. No time for tears, save those for later. Time to get gone. Over the uncharted route, a dead man taught her, always warning her to stop just before the last turn and downhill grade to the house to scope things out on foot. After a rocky 3-hour grind, bouncing through axle-busting arroyos and up steep gravel traces that provided narrow grace between a cliff face and the black nothing below. A ride better made on a mule than a rusty CJ5. You still want to go down there? Oh, hell no. The guns are gone and those bastards might come back. And we don't want to leave sign for no law to find. I don't need to see the body to know he's dead. Okay, then we go back to the Jeep. We go back to the Jeep. They will come for you. I know, but they'll have to find me first. It was crazy what he did. Rat out rivals, then go back into business with their customers. Work for a while. With you out front and him in the shadows until somebody figured it out. That's why I left. I knew it was only a matter of time. Then why come back? You know they'll do to you what they did to him. Rhonda May stopped walking and stared at Armando until he also came to a halt. She thought, but didn't say, because I loved him. I missed him. I missed his craziness. I missed how he made me laugh. I missed the danger, the action, the juice. I missed the way he made love to me and made me feel like I was running out of control, a runaway roller coaster rocketing off the rails. You can stop talking now. See.
Go Vols.
You bet.
This concludes our program for today. Let's give all of our presenters one last big round of applause. If you're interested in joining our Write Club, our next regular meetings are coming up March 19th at 6 p.m. That's Tuesday night. And then April 20th is going to be our next Saturday meeting. That's 10:30. That's right across the hall here in the Shakespeare Room. On behalf of the Write Club, I'd like to invite you all to join us out in the reception, out in the lobby here, and to stop by the author tables for some of our presenters you've just heard. Thank you all again so much for being here today and supporting local authors in your local library.